the most important, probably conflict that we've seen, in the recent years. This is, of course, Russia-Ukraine, and how this has certainly influenced Europe. We've seen the United States obviously has been dragged in. I mean, it has been the number one supporter of NATO. But we've seen an interesting dynamic with Trump recently, now saying that Europe, you're on your own. You're going to have to, continue to fund this war. Give me your thoughts on Russia-Ukraine. And I mean, feel free to go back as far as you want, but I'd like to understand a little bit more this conflict, through your eyes and through game theory.
Yeah. So according to game theory, Russia had no choice but to invade Ukraine in 2022. And the reason why is NATO expansion, right? So NATO was essentially encircling Russia. Ukraine was a red line. And I think that Russia was extremely patient with NATO for many years. But the final step was the 2014 Maidan coup, when the government of Ukraine was overthrown by a CIA-backed coup. And you have these belligerents in the Donetsk region who are trying to ethnically cleanse Russians from that area. And so Putin has expressed it very clearly. He went into Ukraine to defend ethnic Russians who were crying for help. And if you look at what's happening in Ukraine, most of the frontline fighters are ethnic Russians who lived in Ukraine all their lives. And so they're fighting really for the safety and security of their families. So that's something that we have to remember, that Russia was really provoked into this war by NATO. We also have to remember that really Russia's been fighting NATO all this time. I mean, right. The troops are Ukrainian, but look at this. The financing is NATO. The technology is NATO. Special forces, NATO. Command and control, NATO. Targeting, NATO. When a bridge is blown up in Crimea, that's not Ukrainians. They don't have the technology. They don't have the expertise. It's NATO that's doing this. When the Nord Stream pipeline was blown up, that was not the Ukrainians. I mean, the Ukrainians got the blame for it, but that was certainly not the Ukrainians. So for the past few years, Russia has been fighting NATO all this time. And if you just look at what's happening in Ukraine, Russia is winning this war. And it's showing that NATO is really a paper tiger. And I think a lot of it is that Russians are fighting for their civilization. Russians are fighting for their homeland, for the motherland. And NATO has become this overreaching bureaucracy. And it's not very popular even in Europe. As to what's happening between Trump and NATO, I think it's very simple. I think that the empire is in debt. America has $37 trillion in debt. It can no longer finance these wars. So it wants NATO to fight these wars on its behalf. Another way of saying this is that what we've seen is that America has quickly devolved these past few years into a mafia state. It's a mafia empire. And the way that mafia works is it extorts its allies. J.D. Vance goes to Europe and he says, hey guys, you're going to have to start, doing real work. We the Americans are sick of, saving your ass all this time. And that's just the attitude of the Trump administration. So it's not like this war in Ukraine is going to end. It's just that these European countries are supposed to now foot the bill. They're supposed to, pay at least 3% of their GDP. They have to buy all these expensive weapons from America. Eventually, they'll have to draft troops and send them off to Ukraine to die. Now, what's really important to remember is that at the end of the day, this war is hopeless and it's pointless. You cannot possibly beat Russia in the battlefield against Ukraine. They have too many advantages. And ultimately, at the end of the day, Russia has nuclear weapons. Okay, so you can't push Russia too far. And it's pointless because Russia has no intention of threatening Europe. Russia just wants to maintain its security. So why are you sending Europeans to die off in Ukraine for no particular purpose? And I think that this is going to cause tremendous political dissent within Europe. It's possible that within 5 years, you'll have major civil clashes throughout Europe because NATO's trying to draft soldiers, and the young European men refuse to do so.
Yeah. Oh, I could definitely see the future of that because, ironically, I'm here in the United States, and we're actually living very close to a U.S. Army base here and actually I've talked to many people in the area, and one thing I always hear is that Ukraine is the actual best case scenario for us because we get to fight Russia and we don't risk any U.S. lives. No troops on the ground for the United States. Right. So it's the best case. And I always kind of counter that question. I say, well, what about the Ukrainians? What about these people that are, risking their lives and losing their lives and actually getting slaughtered, and young men, having to leave at a very young age? I believe it was the United States or maybe another European ally who had actually asked Zelensky to lower the age of the enlisted soldiers, saying, I think you need to go from 21 down to 20, to get more soldiers in there to fight this war. So, I mean, it's a very hard thing to on one sense, to be in the United States and hear, oh, this is a great thing for America because we get to fight Russia, without risking our lives. But then, not really think about the Ukrainian lives and also the Russian lives that are being lost. I mean, I think you really hit the nail on the head there. This is a pointless and useless war.
Look, I mean, like, Ukraine has no future. Ukraine is finished as a nation, okay? So let's go over the reasons why. The first is the number of casualties on the Ukrainian side. Like, the estimates are between 1 and 2 million men. That's the future of Ukraine. Second is that you've got millions of these Ukrainians who have fled the country as refugees. They've sought refuge in Western countries, and they're not going back because there's no future for them, right? And the third thing is that, so Ukraine is divided into Western Ukraine and Eastern Ukraine. Eastern Ukraine is historically Russian. Western Ukraine is traditionally Poland. And the reality is that Putin is only interested in Eastern Ukraine because it's ethnically Russian, but also because that's where all the resources and agriculture are. If Russia is able to control Donetsk, then the war is over because Western Ukraine is not sustainable. It doesn't have its own agricultural and industrial resources. And what will end up happening is that Western Ukraine will become a welfare state for the Europeans. I hate to say this, but the Europeans really sacrificed Ukraine with this war. Ukraine, by choosing to fight Russia, it's basically doomed itself as a nation.
I think you're spot on with this analysis. Professor, in regards to, what we hear in mainstream media and what we've certainly heard from the U.S. government is, for example, this domino theory, very much that that Putin has much greater plans. If Ukraine falls, that's the first country, Western Europe's going to fall. And I think this is almost similar to the Vietnam War, right? Where the U.S. government had preached, if Vietnam remains communist, one by one, you're going to see communism spread throughout Asia. Of course, we never saw that happen. And that was certainly manufacturing consent, for the Americans to go into Vietnam. Do you see this, I mean, analyze these comments from the U.S. government. Is this just them trying to sell this war and manufacture consent to Westerners?
Look, let's look at the facts, okay?
Sure.
The first fact is that when the Soviet Union fell, when the Berlin Wall fell, the Americans gave the Russians assurances that NATO won't expand, that NATO won't take advantage of the fall of the Soviet Union to expand throughout Europe. America has broken these promises. Okay? That's fact number one.
Correct.
Fact number two, multiple times. Fact number two is that Putin has made multiple overtures to join NATO. Putin said to multiple American presidents, if NATO is a defensive alliance, if it's an alliance based on peace, then Russia wants to be part of that. And then whatever conflicts that will arise, we'll just settle it within NATO. He was constantly buffed by these US presidents, okay? That's the second fact. The third fact is the relentless expansion of NATO. NATO already has 32 members, even though the Soviet Union had failed a long time ago. NATO already has 32 members. There's talk of Moldova becoming the 33rd member, okay? So, these are three facts that we're faced with, that throughout that these past 20, 30 years, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, NATO has been relentlessly expanding towards Russia's sphere of influence, and Russia has been extremely tolerant. You see what's happening in Russia's southern flank, right? Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan. It seems as though NATO is intent on encircling Russia just to protect its own sovereignty, just to protect its sphere of influence, just to protect its own internal cohesion. Then Russia had to act.
That makes complete sense. How do you see this war between Russia and Ukraine ending? I mean, do you see it ending anytime soon? I think the data, as you've mentioned already, and as many military analysts has now seen, is that Russia is winning the battle. I mean, it is a war of attrition right now. And so, again, if you just simply take your emotion away from this and look at the reality, you look at the numbers, obviously it's a lot of casualties and a lot of wasted resources. But Russia does have the upper hand. Do you see this as a conflict that President Trump, is going to try to? I mean, he famously said, by day one, I'm going to be able to end this war. Obviously, that hasn't happened. Do you see this a conclusion within the next 6 months, year? Is this going to be another forever war? What is your thoughts on that?
I think you've talked to most military analysts, as you say, the war is lost. Russia has been able to establish battlefield dominance, that's air superiority. Its soldiers are extremely well disciplined. They have high morale. They're very innovative. If you just go and look at online videos of interviews of these frontline soldiers in Russia, I mean, they are extremely disciplined. They want to see this thing to the finish, and they're highly motivated. And it's the complete opposite for the Ukrainians. The decision rate among the Ukrainians, it's very, very high. And so at this point, I think that what's best for Ukraine is to cut your losses. Unfortunately, in geopolitics, and especially in game theory, there's something called a sunk cost fallacy, right? So you go to the casino, you win $100,000 and you feel great. At the end of the night, you lose $1 million. You can't leave now because of sunk cost fallacy. You have to get it back. Okay, so that's the situation the Europeans are facing. They've sucked in billions of dollars in Ukraine. Ukraine has promised the Europeans, especially the British, all these rare earth minerals, all this wealth untapped in Ukraine. It would be a complete loss of faith if NATO were to surrender right now. So because of some cost fallacy, unfortunately, we can expect that this war will drag on. Now, what's really important to understand is that the Russians, even though they're winning this war, they fight it really slowly because the Russians use trench artillery warfare, so you have to move these artillery pieces into place. But also, what people don't really understand is Russia is trying to minimize both civilian casualties as well as their own troop casualties. They're trying to cause as little damage to the critical civilian infrastructure as much as possible, because at the end of the day, they still believe that this is part of the Russian homeland, and they want people to move back and rebuild their lives in this area. They have to make this livable. So Russia faces a governance problem after this war ends, and that's why Russia has been extremely strategic, methodical, and slow in the process. But unfortunately, this gives time for the Ukrainians and for NATO to regroup. And so what I think is going to happen is that Russia will slowly advance. Putin will constantly call for peace, call for an end to the slaughter. Trump will also call for an end to the slaughter, but because of some cost fallacy, because the Europeans have basically deluded themselves that this war is still winnable, then they will establish new front lines. And I think that the final battle will take place in Odessa. I think the fate of Ukraine will be decided in Odessa. Putin and his generals have already stated that Odessa is the end goal. Once they have Odessa, they have control of eastern Ukraine. Ukraine becomes landlocked, and Russia will be able to control the Black Sea access. So Odessa is the main goal of the Russians. NATO knows this, and NATO will basically invest a lot of resources in Odessa. So I predict in a few years' time, Odessa will be the final battle. But unfortunately, because Russia uses artillery warfare, because NATO is very stubborn, this thing will last for a long time.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's definitely, certainly what many analysts are saying. And I think, looking at that, it has now become a war of attrition. I think that is what is going to happen. Interesting thought about Odessa. I can see exactly why Putin would say that and why that would be the end goal. Professor,